Okay, thank you. I'm Dylan DeThomas. I'm VP of External Affairs for the Recycling Partnership and chair of the Truth in Labeling Task Force. And I will pass the introduction baton to Anya. Anya?
Hi there, Dr. Anya Brandon, U.S. Plastics Policy Analyst with Ocean Conservancy and serving as Vice Chair for the Oregon Truth in Labeling Task Force.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Alex Bertolucci of Oregon DEQ for supporting us. And now I'll introduce our two panelists. Patrick, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, Patrick Krieger, Vice President of Sustainability and Industry Affairs at the Plastics Industry Association.
Thank you. And Steve.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Alexander, excuse me, and I'm president of the Association of Plastic Recyclers.
Fantastic. So we are here to talk about the resin identification code. And the goal of this little mini panel this afternoon is to ask some questions about the RIC, as we'll call it, the resin identification code. We'll use the acronym RIC to be able to describe that, to be able to give some more information to our task force members. And then when we reconvene on April 20th, we'll hold time so you can be asked additional questions by task force members if we don't capture them. So let's dig in. So our first question is for you, Steve. And the question is how do plastics recyclers use the RIC?
Thank you, Chairman Thomas. I think we use it to identify material and containers that are not readily identifiable either by NIR sortation or actually prior to that, that may not be necessarily clear to the whole sortation mechanism. So obviously sortation has become a little more automated with NIR sortation that's really been introduced in the last 8 to 10 years. But beyond that, we still need to use a code so that we can identify certain types of material and what the container is comprised of, so it goes into the proper stream.
So is it used by all plastics reclaimers, or is it sort of like an item by item? And I just know that there's different levels of sophistication depending on your reclaimers, your member companies. You know, is it used by all at some point, or is it only used by those who have fewer, less technology, to that point?
Every plastic reclaimer uses the resin identification code in some way, shape, or form. And actually, one could argue that the resin identification code is more critical today than it was when it was first announced in the marketplace back in the late 80s and early 90s. The forms of packaging back then were pretty standard across the board. And with the evolution of packaging, particularly in the last 7 to 10 years, it's much more complex than we have today. We have multiple multi-laminate, multi-material out there. So the code is a critically important piece that the recyclers depend upon to ensure the consistency of the stream of material and try to reduce the tremendous increase in contamination that we face every day.
Thanks so much, Steve. Following up on that a little bit, how does the RIC interact with some of the problematic materials that we've been charged with looking at as a task force?
So clearly, I mean, the proper utilization of the RIC, we lost that 20 years ago. Okay, I mean, if you read the language, the RIC was clearly defined to be utilized in certain ways, and it is certainly been hijacked to consumer education and what have you. But if you're getting materials these days that might be a combination of resins, we know from a technical standpoint that say a high density container can take a certain blend at a certain level of, say, polypropylene or vice versa. But it cannot take say some sort of barrier layer or a type of additive that in fact renders it non-compatible with say that particular designated stream of material. And also when you have a mixing of resins or a mixing of materials, that becomes really where the critical nature of the code becomes, because again, it's all about sortation of material. Because, when we talk about recycling, the recyclability of a container is, as you all know, I know I'm preaching to the choir, one small component of the entire system. It's got to be designed properly, and then we've got to make sure the consumer puts it in the right bin. But then the material has to be sorted. And people tend to think of sortation solely at the MRF facility. But essentially, a reclaimer is the same as the MRF, just one step further down the line.
Mhm.
We have to sort material appropriately. And we have to understand certain things like what's the density of the material? Because recycling is based upon what we call a float sink technology. And so PET typically tends to sink in the process. And so high density and polypropylene will float away. But in fact, if you use too much of a filler in PET, say a calcium carbonate, which we have standards for, if you're using 30% calcium carbonate in a PET container, then that material is going to have an impact and potentially go away with the high density in the polyethylene, which then contaminates the polyethylene stream. So looking at the type of container that you have and the type of material that you have, the designation ostensibly helps identify what the primary resin of that particular container, and that's really how we use it.
That's great. So how do MRFs use the RIC, Steve? And I know that you represent plastic recyclers, but obviously you have a great deal of interaction with MRFs. So to your understanding, how do MRFs use the RIC?
Well, I think they're using the same way, but how do I say this properly? Less so. So typically recyclers are broken up by resin per se. So a PET recycler is looking for a material just PET, and so they're more worried about the pristine nature of the purity of that PET bale as it comes through. Because of the volume of material that a MRF it tends to handle and the speed upon which they're forced to handle that material, they tend to rely on optical sortation unless there is a container that may be new into their system, into their marketplace, where they slow down the system and they'll check the container, or they'll check with us, and they'll start, if we tell them that's a contaminant, they'll pull that material. But they tend to do that less than a reclaimer does. Because the MRF's operation they're dealing with much more volume, much greater speed than a recycler. And they tend to be less worried about, at the end of the day, the universal nature of the bale that they're producing for the recycler. So we typically, unless there is shall we say, an egregious material that's in the marketplace, MRFs will tell you right now, say multi-laminate, multi-material pouches or something, they know that's not recyclable. But typically what they use the code for is a new type of container that they see coming down the pipe. That's a short answer to a long question, sorry.
Fair enough, Steve. Okay, so lastly, how do you, from your interactions with communities, how do communities use the RIC?
Well, excuse me, what we've seen is communities use the RIC to communicate with their publics in terms of what they accept in their system. And, we can debate this all day. I mean, it was not intended to be a communication tool, but we've lost that argument a long time ago. So they'll say, yeah, we collect your 1s and your 2s, or we'll collect your 5s. And I think, unfortunately, when they do that, based on what they collect, it leaves the impression that other materials are not recyclable. And, so I think that, you've heard us talk about the fact that there's great demand for polypropylene material in the recycling market space, and how, we want to encourage the utilization and the incorporation of polypropylene in collection programs. But so, it can be used as an education and communication standpoint. The difficulties become is that it has been abused to the extent where I think that general publics have less confidence in what that symbol actually means, which leads us today to talk about truth and labeling and things of that nature. There needs to be clearly a consumer communication vehicle. It may be separate from a RIC. The only thing I can make very clear is the plastic recyclers need some sort of resin identification code. We're not necessarily tied to a particular format. We need a code. And just let me just say that we shouldn't just slough off the fact of changing the code and what it's going to cost. I mean, typically you're talking between $10,000 and $15,000 to change a mold with a code on it. You got companies with 1,000, 2,000 molds, you're getting to tens of millions of dollars when you start talking about this. So we don't underestimate the impact of changing the code and the label system and how it's used. But clearly what we're doing isn't working, and we need to try and help with better communication to the communities.
Thank you, Steve. That's great. That's actually a perfect segue to Patrick. So Patrick, your organization, your trade association represents the converters of the materials, among other folks. You can clarify that when you get there. But you have a direct connection to that. So one of the pieces, after you maybe clarify my statement, we wanted to ask what the costs are connected with for manufacturers in changing those molds. So, maybe you can underline what Steve said or offer a different range.
Sure, and you're right. So the Plastics Industry Association is the trade association in the United States that represents the full plastic supply chain. That means the equipment, mold makers, material suppliers, recyclers, and yes, those processors, converters at the end. Steve is largely right that the individual cost for changing a mold could be somewhere around $15,000. The reason being because when we have those molds and those markings within those molds, they can be in there in two different ways. You can actually have those that are inserted into the mold, and those are relatively easy to switch out. And then there are others, the much more common way is that they are actually cut into the mold itself. That's a more arduous process to fix. And to do that, you would have to change, essentially a company would charge per cavity in the mold, and mold sizes are very different across a lot of different industries. But for example, a PET water bottle mold can have 96 cavities in it.
Oh, wow.
And a company that is making water bottles or any of these other kinds of packaging formats, as Steve mentioned, has many, many molds. This is not a one or two mold situation. And the other thing to point out is that cost is not just the actual physical cost of changing the mold itself, right? You have all these operational costs about taking molds out of service, so production loss, and that can really be exacerbated if we have to take them out outside of their service cycle. In those charges also, I think I would just want to point out the fact that those charges are actually higher and more onerous for smaller companies because they don't have the scale, they don't have the extra molds that they can slot into the system, and they probably don't have the relationships with somebody who can easily do that for them to retrofit those molds very quickly. So that's all important to think about. And then just one other item when we talk about costs is even more than all of this is the added complexity and cost of maintaining compliance with multiple state regulations. That's a real big issue for our industry because could you imagine the logistical nightmare of trying to keep segregated products for different states where really the only difference is a mark that is intended in the standard to be located in an unobtrusive place. So it creates a lot of complexity, not just for us, but for the people downstairs or downstream rather, who are using those products in inventory management.
Thank you, Patrick. That was perfect. Alex, you have a question.
Yeah, a follow-up to that. How long do molds last?
Great question.
That is a great question. Molds can last for decades if maintained properly.
Whoa. I was not expecting that answer. Thus my noise. Okay, so I'm assuming that the costs are similar, but maybe you can kind of clarify of like, say, what if you were adding or getting rid of a shape? So you have the mold. So obviously there are some percentage of the mold makers that allow you to drop in a mold. So you know, you said that, but for the ones that were that have the you know, have it there, you know, what would the cost be connected to, like adding something to that or getting rid of it? Would there be a difference between those two pieces?
So adding to or getting rid of. So recognize the fact that if I'm adding to or getting rid of something, if what we're talking about is the chasing arrows around a number and we want to move to a solid triangle, that is easier to do because what we're doing is we could in theory scribe a thicker line. I didn't do this, maybe somebody else you know did. It's taking an F and making it into a B on a report, right? It's possible to do, you can do it. Removing it entirely might be a little more difficult because that's not necessarily a surgical process, right? There are two different ways you can do it. You can weld more metal onto it and then polish it down, or you can kind of thinly cut the surface and remove more of the metal and then scribe it back in. That one is a little more difficult because recognize that molds are precision equipment in a lot of cases, and also certain packaging types and certain product types, you want them to look a very specific way. And if we've had to carve out a thing, it might be different. So you can do that. It's not easy. So the numbers that I say about $15,000 per, you know, mold of a complex mold is for that kind of either welding or cutting away.
Super helpful. Okay, so I'm curious in terms of compliance you know, you talked about that in terms of challenges between states. Are there any examples of RIC compliance on label and not on package? So meaning again, like being on that the label itself as opposed to, you know, in that mold piece.
So something more akin to like the bottle deposit, right? Where it has the bottle deposit in the states where it's valid. So there's no compliance anywhere that allows it on the label currently because it's for the product itself, and the label itself could be of a different material. It could accidentally fall off. You know, for certain things, the label's designed to be removed. There's no way to be compliant with the RIC in its current standard at ASTM by putting it on a label. That doesn't mean that it couldn't change, and that's something to explore. But that is something that you would have to consider is what happens if you remove a label.
Well, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the fact of the matter is that the recyclers wash the label off. I mean, we want the label off. We've created floatable labels, you know, I mean, full rack shrink labels are a whole big problem for recyclers, and we've created technology and label technology. So you want a floatable label, and if you don't have a floatable label, the other thing most recyclers have called a delabeler, where we rip that label off and we beat the head. So putting it on a label is really not, it's not going to work. It's not going to help. That's just the reality.
So Steve, I have a question on, and apologies, Chairman, if I'm taking liberties, but
do I have to answer his questions?
I'm curious, you're saying delabeled in its current structure, right? Could you do the sortation first and then remove the labels after? I'm just curious. Please feel free to cut this out.
It depends on the system, the proprietary system. By and large, what you do is, you know, remember you're going through a float sink process, and so that's where the sortation takes place. So you're typically washing the labels off or dealing with them before they get to the float sink process. So that really wouldn't work at this point.
That's fair. And we'll leave this in and double it, Alex. So just to put it in twice. Okay. All right. So I connected to that, I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of conversation around industry-led RIC reform among those of us who are in the RIC circles. And I was wondering if you can give a bit of an update or a timeline on those efforts. The question has come up a number of times during the course of our Truth in Labeling task force. And so this is one I know that the task force would want to ask.
Yeah, that makes sense. So from plastic standpoint, we used to be called SPI. And so we created the RIC. And we now know that it's managed by ASTM, we all know that. But we kind of feel like it's our legacy product, and also because of our position in the industry, we really want to make sure that we're taking an active role in addressing this issue. Because we don't think that it works in its current form. I know that the recyclers need a RIC in some form, and we want to make sure that that exists. And so we are trying to coordinate this conversation among these industry groups to make sure that whatever we either change, update, enhance, replace it with works the way it's intended to. I think Steve made the point earlier that we may have lost the battle or lost the argument on how the RIC is currently used versus how it was intended. I do want to clarify here that from plastic standpoint, we always maintain that the RIC is an aid to recyclability. It is not a guarantee. It's very similar to when you go to the movies and a movie is rated PG-13, right? Just because it's a PG-13 movie doesn't let a mom is going to have her teen go to it, right? There's a lot of other reasons. And so it's a piece of information. It can't be the only piece of information that's being shared. So we want to make sure that whatever we replace the system with, we do it right, because there's the only thing worse than making a bad change is having to make two bad changes. And so we want to make sure that it works, it makes sense, and we are very aware of the statutory timeline and kind of with the sense of urgency here. So I can't give you a 100% definitive consensus. August 8th is going to be when we're done. I can't do that because we're all people and we all have other issues that we're trying to wrestle with. But this is a priority for us. We are moving forward as rapidly as we can, and we're happy to have you all involved and to give you updates as we progress through the process.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a couple of questions to that, Mr. Krieger?
Please do.
So I have 3 points. First of all, I would love to be involved or engaged in whatever discussion you're having about the code,
Yep.
since it primarily affects our industry. Secondly, I'm way older than you, and I was personally responsible for making the resin identification code law in 17 states from 1989 to 1991. So I have a lot of experience with the resin identification code and what its intent was going forward. Thirdly, I think the bigger issue is for us as an organization, people talk about the ASTM version. And, is that a solution? You want to make sure that whatever changes you make actually enhance a solution, because our data and our consumer testing has shown that the triangle versus chasing arrows makes no difference to the consumer in terms of the recycling message you're sending out there. So if we're talking about truth in labeling, just going with what ASTM has transformed the code into as today is not going to help. It's not going to solve the problem. To Patrick's point, you don't want to have to make 2 bad changes. You need to make sure that you're dealing with something here, because this is a labeling task force we're talking about. It's not about resin identification code or helping the recyclers. So we may need 2 different pathways here to solve these issues. So just something that you want to think about. So
Thank you, Steve.
So
Oh, go ahead, Patrick.
I will also say, to respond to a few of those points. So first of all, Steve, congratulations on getting legislation passed in 19 states is not easy. It's in 29 states now currently, and that's our big concern. Yeah, it's 39, and I think it like specific. So
Right.
our biggest concern now is that there are all of those states where it is currently enshrined in law. So we are trying to figure out whatever system we do. We sell products nationally, so we have to make sure that we are thinking about Oregon and Iowa and Louisiana and on and on and on. APR is definitely a big part of that conversation because, as you say, you are a big part of it. You're not the only part of it, right? Again, our mold maker members have to make those things. Our processors are the people who have to put it on the products themselves. And ultimately, our entire industry is being held accountable
Right.
to recycling issues. Much of the confusion stems from the RIC code in its
I will
current.
say that there is a history of making changes to the code, because when the code was first enacted, PET, number one was PET. And there was a lawsuit filed by the PET evaporated milk company. And so we ended up having to go back into those states at the time and change it PET to PETE. So, these types of things have happened before. And, but this is a whole nother ball game. That was before the code was really, used as an educational tool. It was still probably a resin identification type code scenario. That was very early on, like 92, we had to deal with that.
Well, and I think, Steve, to your other point about saying that this is ultimately about truth in labeling and consumer confusion, there are two ways to fix consumer confusion. One is to address the fundamental issue, and we're working on that. But the other one is consumer education. We need to be doing a better job as an industry, and we're happy to partner with others to communicate to people how they're supposed to recycle appropriately for where they live. What the RIC code actually means to them, and the myriad of other challenges in trying to get someone into recycle properly. We're happy to educate people in that way.
I would argue that's not your responsibility. This has been hijacked by the brands, and they're putting it all over the place where it doesn't belong. I mean, the code is very clear. It's not supposed to be on film and flexible material. It's supposed to be on rigid containers, 8 ounces to 5 gallons. In some states, it's supposed to be just on beverage containers. So, I mean, I get infuriated about this. I apologize because I have a lot of personal time invested in this. But I think, and then the fact that somehow it's incumbent upon you and us in order to educate the consumer. There are other groups that spend billions every year telling the consumer what to buy and how to do certain things. It should be part of a marketing campaign. Anyway, you can cut that out, Mr. Chairman, but I get infuriated because we didn't cause the problem. We created a solution to the mix-up of recycling issues, and somehow it was diverted, and somehow it's our responsibility and it's our fault. And that's what I just think we shouldn't be solving the problem that someone else created without at least their help. Other than that, I have no opinion.
Well, I would underline that is a sentiment shared by the many of the task force members that was shared during the earlier meetings. So there was a question from Alex in the chat of, Steve, would you be able to share your research of the triangle versus chasing arrows piece, or point us to that?
I'll share a summary of it. I can't share the exact research, but I'll share a summary of it, which essentially is, but what I said, but I'll put it in a better form for you. Okay.
That'd be grateful. Yes, absolutely. So that was a really great conversation. Are there other questions from Alex or Dr. Brandon?
I have one question that came up at the last task force meeting, and it was around, so currently California has some different standards around, using the triangle versus the RIC, or, the chasing arrows on packaging. How does that currently affect, all of you who use this or are putting this on there? How do you currently deal with those issues or other state-by-state issues that you might not know about?
I'm going to let Patrick answer first because I know what people are telling me they're doing right now, but he might have the same answer, but I want to see.
Well, now I'm really curious. So what I would say is what we are hoping to do is to solve the issue in such a way that we aren't creating a conflict between having to be compliant in California and not being compliant in many other states in the United States.
So I think what Patrick is saying, what I'm hearing is people are, if they're changing their molds to be compliant with California and just putting a triangle on and hoping other states follow.
And one more question there, if I may, Dylan.
Please.
Our research has shown that there's not ever been enforcement by one of those other 36 states for their chasing arrows laws or their RIC laws. Steve, you're very familiar with them, it sounds like. Do either of you know about enforcement that's been taken by the state, not necessarily a class action lawsuit or something like that, but specifically from the state to enforce one of the RIC laws?
So I would say, much to my mother's chagrin, I'm not a lawyer. So this is not a legal answer. Just because a law has not previously been enforced does not mean that it won't be enforced in the future.
Yeah, it's never been enforced. And it's very frustrating. But there's a long history of these sorts of things. The RPPC law in California has been very infrequently enforced, even though we continue to hammer at them all the time. And I think, I mean, I don't mean to be glib, but, in conversations with the California Commission, I said this very clearly. You want to clear this issue up? Enforce the law that's on your books today. Enforce it. And then you after people who are fraudulently using the code. And you can clear this up pretty quickly if you just start enforcing the law that's on the books. Is it going to cost some people some money? The people who are erroneously and fraudulently using the label will no longer be able to use it. They'll have to stop putting the molds and putting the symbol on the label. But the law is pretty clear in terms of how you're supposed to use the code. But no one's ever enforced the law.
In California, to be clear. That you're talking
pretty much across the United States, no one has ever really enforced it. There are 2 states that have said that if you want to put the code on for PET on a container, you have to get APR approval. I've never had, and they've been on the books for over 10 years. I've never received a phone call about getting approval for any of that. And I've been around, I mean, I'm not that hard to find. So
Your phone number's out there for sure. Yeah.
It's out there for sure, right?
Which
Don't
2
stay aware.
states are that, Steve? Do you know?
Kentucky and I think North Carolina.
Okay.
And Kentucky, you can't call Kentucky. They tell me it's not a state, it's a commonwealth. So I've got to clear that up all the time.
Fair enough. Yes. Okay. Are there other questions? Alex, thank you for asking those follow-up questions. That's great, because those are, I didn't catch those from the task force, which I'm sure they'll be happy to hear answered. Anya, or Dr. Brandon, do you have any further questions?
No, I appreciate both of your time and insights on this.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you in advance for participating in our April 20th meeting, our 5th Truth in Labeling Task Force meeting, where there will be time set aside to ask direct questions by the rest of the task force. And with that, thank you all.